Well, hi everybody. So today we'll be looking at big Radials Norseman here. We'll do what we normally do, or at least what I normally do, which is have a look at the cockpit, kind of get the thing started, look at some of the features, go fly around for a second, and then at the end of all this, go ahead and do a little bit of a short review here. And that'll pretty much be it for today, so let's go ahead and get started. Alrighty, well here we are in the Norseman. It definitely does look really pretty good in here. I don't really have any complaints on it. I will say they obviously went with a rust bucket aesthetic for this one, and I think they accomplished that pretty well. This thing definitely does look like it may fall apart mid-flight. But either way, I think it came out quite nice. So we're going to go ahead and have a look at some of the features, go ahead and get this thing started, take it off, and go fly it around for a second. Now, as far as the features go, we can go ahead and open up all four doors if we want. We can come back here to the cargo hold. We can put down the benches for the passengers if you want. We can also do this from the TV, which is up here. So we can go ahead and click on this, and it'll bring up this TV, which pretty much doubles as your tablet. Come in here to the status page. This is where all of the visual features for the plane are going to be contained. We can change the variation in the back for the cargo and everything. We can swap out the cargo types between crates and barrels, put the chocks in, put some covers on it, open and close the doors from here as well. Now these little yellow rectangles here, kind of in the center of the fuselage, this is going to allow you to hide or show the cargo. This is only a visual thing. It will not actually remove the weight from the cargo, so in order to do that, we'll have to come up here to the weight menu and zero all of these things out, so you can actually remove the weight. That'll pretty much do it for the status page, so we'll come in here and we'll go to the next one, which is checklists. Now, I'm not going to go through any of these, but this is where all the checklists are contained. We have settings. This page is just going to be quick start options, so we can return the plane to cold and dark, or we can get it ready for takeoff or ready for taxi. And then help is your autopilot. Last thing here is this switch. I don't know what that does. Last thing we're going to talk about, though, is the modern avionics suite that we have here, which is up here in this little visor thing. We can go ahead and pull this down. We kind of have the default, Garmin, which is kind of nice to have in this thing. But that's pretty much it here for the features, or at least all I'm going to go through. So we're going to go ahead and get this thing started. Alrighty, well, we'll go ahead and get this thing started. So we want to come over here to the right side of the cockpit. We want to turn on the battery, turn on the alternator. Come up here, turn on the magnetos to both. Go ahead and put the mixture up to rich. We'll put the propeller pitch up to max. Come over here to the left side of the cockpit, to the fuel selector. We want to make sure that we have selected a tank. It doesn't really matter which one, as long as it has fuel in it. Then we want to come down here to the manual fuel pump. We want to click on this 4 times. We're looking for about 4 psi on your fuel pressure gauge, which ends up being about 4 clicks with this thing. We'll come up here to the primer. Go ahead and click on this 6 times. We'll come over here to the starter. We'll hold this in its down position for about 10 seconds. You want to make sure that we have cracked the throttle at least a little bit. Then we'll move it into its up position. And it starts right up. So we'll go ahead and head out to the runway here and take this thing off. Alrighty, well, before we take off, I wanted to go over the auxiliary fuel tank back here. This is not technically a selectable fuel tank. So the way this works is we're going to have to open this valve up here, and it will drain the fuel from this tank into the rear fuselage tank. Now, it does this very, very slowly. So if this is the only fuel that you have left on the plane, you're going to have a very bad time. It will not drain out of here fast enough to actually keep the engine running. So what we're going to want to do is we want to make sure that this valve is in the open position pretty much from the time that we take off. That way it'll just go ahead and start draining the fuel over time. So again, as long as the valve is in the 6 o'clock position here, it is closed, or it's open, and when it's in the 9 o'clock position here, it is closed. Just keep that in mind, because it does not supply the tank with enough fuel to keep the engine running. Now, as far as how this thing taxis, it is a pretty well-behaved thing to taxi. It has a bit of a tendency to want to swing the tail around if you're making a sharp turn or you're turning it around. Other than that, it's really easy to taxi. Now, as far as taking it off, it's easy to take off. It just does not really like to leave the ground. So just be aware of that one. Probably want to trim the nose up a little bit to kind of help it as you're going down the runway. We're going to go ahead and throttle up here. We're going to take it up to about 2,400. You pretty much full throttle it if you want to. But it does take it a little bit to kind of get rolling. But once it gets rolling, it's actually still pretty slow. So eventually here we'll get going. Tail wheel should lift off the ground somewhere around about 60 miles an hour. Might get a little squirrely when that happens, especially if you're in a crosswind. Either way, we're looking for something around about 90 miles an hour if we don't have the flaps down. We're going to want to begin pulling back on the yoke. We're going to have to pull back on the yoke pretty far to actually get the lift off the ground. Again, it does not like to leave the ground. It just does not. Now, as far as how this thing flies, I quite like how it flies. It is a bit sluggish. That's not a complaint or anything. It's just an observation. Anything that you're going to kind of tell this thing to do, it's going to take it a second or two to actually do. So don't expect to be doing really quick rolls. It takes it a while to climb. It's not horrible, but it's not exactly the fastest climbing plane ever. Now, one thing I have noticed about this thing is that it tends to be a little bit nose heavy until you get to upwards of around about maybe 130 miles an hour, and then it tends to balance itself out quite nicely. But either way, it's a fairly fun plane to fly. I really do kind of like how heavy it feels and all the rest of that stuff, because it does feel like it's kind of heavy. Now, as far as its flight characteristics go, some of that is going to change depending upon how much weight you actually have on this thing. So if it's empty, it's going to behave a little bit differently than it does if all the cargo's on there. It's also going to make the takeoff distance a little bit shorter. Other than that, as far as how it stalls and everything like that, the stall is a little strange. I'm not complaining about it or anything like that. It's not going to spin you or do anything like that. It's a pretty gentle stall. It's going to happen somewhere around 70, 75 miles an hour, depending upon whether or not you have the flaps down. As far as its top speed, you're looking at something around about 150. Might be able to get 160 miles an hour out of it. As far as I can tell, there isn't any engine damage on this thing, so you really don't have to worry about like hooking the engines or anything. So you can pretty much full throttle it all the time. Unless that's what that little white switch on the TV is for. I didn't notice any engine damage. I didn't fail the engine or anything like that while I was testing it out and flying it around. It pretty much full throttle the whole time. Either way, I quite enjoy flying this one, so I'm going to turn around here and head back to the runway, and I'll see y'all back here in a second when I come in for a landing. Alrighty, well, we'll bring it in here for a landing. We're going to go ahead and put the flaps down to 30 degrees. You can go ahead and put them down to 40 if you want, but 30 is fine. Now, the flaps are going to cause the plane to kind of lift itself when you initially put them down, and it does create a fair amount of drag. We want to come in here at about 100 miles an hour. So with the flaps down, to maintain that, we're going to need to be somewhere around about 2100 RPM. Now, oddly enough, the only thing that this plane does do quickly is actually slow down. So you can put the flaps down and really slow this thing down pretty close to the end of the runway here, the beginning of the runway. It'll slow down pretty well. But either way, we want to come in here at about 100 to 105 miles an hour. We want to set the plane down somewhere around about 80. I kind of like 75. It seems to be a little bit smoother for me, which again might just be me. Now, the only thing I will say about this thing is it's very hard to see out of this plane. So, but it looks like I've lined myself up pretty nicely here, so just kind of trust that I can maintain my line. A little low, that's okay. Go ahead and just begin to reduce the throttle. It does set itself down pretty gently once you begin to reduce the throttle. A little bit of a bounce as I came in a little too fast on that one. But that's okay. That's why I kind of prefer about 75 miles an hour. Either way, don't really have to worry about nose planting this thing or anything like that. It will do it if you come in here too quickly and you really slam on the brakes. It will nose plant. But in terms of if you have a pretty good distance on your runway, you really wouldn't have a problem with it. It might be a little difficult, or I guess maybe a bit of a challenge to take this thing off on some short runways. The same thing with landing it. But that is somewhat of the fun of this plane, I think. So that's pretty much it for this. We're going to go ahead and go into the review here, and that'll pretty much be it for today. Alrighty, well, if you want to pick up the Norseman here, it's available from BigRadials.com for about 20 bucks. You get 3 variants of it, 2-wheeled and then 1 float plane. There aren't any landing gear on the float version, so you can have to start in the water with that one. It's a fairly fun plane to fly. It looks good and it sounds good, and that's pretty much the short version. I'll start off here with the model quality. The interior model is great. Everything joins together real nice. I didn't find anything to complain about. There is a little bit of light that comes through the back of the cargo area, but it's so minor I wouldn't worry about it. There certainly isn't anything that's like in your face wrong with it. Moving on to the exterior, it's easily as good as the interior, with the small exception of what I'm going to call the fuselage for the tail wheel. If you look directly up, you can see through the model. It's most noticeable on the float version because the tail wheel isn't there to obstruct your view. I wouldn't worry about it too much either. It's just one of those things you're going to have to be looking for to notice, and just flying the plane around, you'll probably never notice it. As far as the animations go, everything came out really good. It's nice and smooth. Aside from the tail wheel thing, no complaints on the model, and overall, it came out really good. I think Big Radials did a great job with this plane. The interior looks great. I think what I called it earlier was a rust bucket aesthetic, and I think they did a really good job with it. The exterior, again, is equally as good as the interior. It's not nearly as rusty, but it has its fair share of paint chips and has sort of a grimy look to it. If you get it into the sun at the right angle, you can really see how grimy it is. The liveries themselves came out quite nicely too. Aesthetically, it's a very nice looking plane. Overall, I think they did a fantastic job texturing this one. Alrighty, well the sounds are pretty good with a minor exception, which is the compass and cabin light switches and missing sound effects. It's a very minor problem and nothing that would inhibit me from wanting to purchase this one. What I thoroughly do like about this thing though is the engine sounds. The startup, the running engine, they all sound great. It sounds really nice and idle. It might not sound exactly like the real thing, but it's pretty good. Everything for the most part seems to have a sound effect. There are some creaks and groans, the flaps make noise, it has some touchdown sound effects and everything like that. You might not hear the floats make contact with the water in the exterior view, but the sound effect is there. It's just, it tends to get drowned out by the engine. It's a little bit quieter in the interior than I was expecting, and from the exterior it's nice and loud. Overall, the sounds came out pretty good. As far as the flight model goes, my personal opinion is I like flying this thing around. The finer points are it has a heavy feel to it, it's got a pretty slow roll rate, you can improve that a little bit with your rudder. It does not climb very fast. In general, it does not like to leave the ground. But once it's up there, it's nice to fly. I don't think it's my imagination, but it does seem like the flight characteristics change a little bit depending upon the payload weight. Mostly that seems to apply to the takeoff run. Now the runway that I use in these reviews here is about 2,500 feet long. It takes about 75 to 80% of the runway to take off. That's with the flaps up. Putting them down will cut that down a little bit, but not much. For as heavy as it feels, it certainly does a very nice stall turn. When you put the flaps down, it pitches the nose up, and they do produce a fair amount of drag. Overall, it's smooth, it's predictable, it's going to do what you expect it to do, albeit somewhat slowly. Overall, it's a pretty fun plane to go fly around. The features that come along with this thing are quite nice. You get most of the normal stuff like chocks, engine covers, and whatnot, plus you get a little bit of customization with the cargo area. The TV tablet thing was a bit unexpected, along with its Blockbuster and Windows 98 stickers. You end up with 6 liveries. It's the same 6 across all 3 variants of the plane. I don't really know that I consider the autopilot to be a feature, but it is in here. There are going to be 2 bush trips that will be released at a later date. I'm not sure when, but from what it looks like in the manual, it's going to have something to do with southern Chile, from a place called Villa O'Higgins to Puerto Williams. It's a little over a 600-mile flight. I don't know where Villa O'Higgins is, but Puerto Williams is like the southernmost point of South America. Either way, it'll probably be a pretty fun flight. Well, I don't really have much else to say on this thing other than kind of reiterate some of the things I've already said about it. It's a pretty good deal for about 20 bucks. I certainly have had fun flying it. Might be a little challenging to take off at the shorter strips, but it makes for some fun either way. And it definitely does stop faster than it takes off. It looks pretty good, it sounds pretty good, and it's a fun thing to go fly around in. And that's pretty much going to be it for today, guys. So thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.